One of the better-known Greek gods was Hermes. Hermes was of course known as messenger of the gods. In Greek art, he is often depicted with his famous winged shoes. Hermes was also the god of travelers because of his role as guide. He was especially known as Psychopompos, guide of the dead, and was one of the few beings who could travel to the underworld unimpeded. His name comes from Herma, a heap of stones, and designates the stone cairn marking boundaries and portals. Finally, from birth, Hermes was known as a trickster. When he was born, he immediately went about playing mischief. By carving up a turtle and using sheep gut, he created the first lyre, which he sold to Apollo in exchange for 50 golden cows. As trickster, Hermes was constantly breaking taboos. Of course, the Romans called Hermes Mercury, and this god was in fact always associated with the planet of the same name. And in part, one begins to see how this god obtains his characteristics simply by watching the behavior of this wandering luminary in the sky. From the view of an observer on Earth, Mercury and the Sun are wedded. Not only is this planet closest to the Sun, but it never is seen in the sky anywhere but near the Sun's domain. This close relationship suggests Hermes' role as messenger, for he always rises and sets in rhythm with the chief power in the heavens. Further, due to its position in orbit relative to the Earth's, Mercury is seen as the most erratic wanderer in the sky. Its orbital inclinations are extreme as it dances in and out of the position around the celestial orb of the Sun. Meanwhile, it's very hard to see, appearing and disappearing apparently erratically. Of all the wandering stars, Mercury is the most mischievous, a trickster by nature due to his capricious cosmic dance. Most importantly, however, because Mercury is never seen far from the Sun's light obscures the planet during the day, making the only time an observer can see the planet right before sunrise in the east, or right after sunset in the west. Mercury is literally seen at the two portals or seams on the horizon where, in ancient cosmography, the sun emerges or descends into the underworld. Thus, his identity as guide, but especially as guide of the dead, is analogous to the appearance of the planet only at the eastern and western gates of the underworld. He is steward of the ultimate boundaries. In Greek myth, the universe was created by Uranus, who was castrated and conquered by Kronos, who wed Rhea and gave birth to the Olympian gods, including Zeus. Zeus eventually overthrew Kronos to become the new ruler of the cosmos. From earliest times, Kronos was associated with the planet Saturn. Saturn is the furthest planet seen by the naked eye and takes nearly 30 years to complete one orbit around the Sun. But because the Earth is rotating around the Sun nearly 30 times during this period, Saturn appears to be doing a back-step, forward-step dance in the sky. Saturn makes 28 retrograde movements during its 30-year circuit as seen from Earth. As the planet that takes the longest measure around the sky, it cuts up the sky with its scissor-like retrograde movements. The behavior of the planet dictates some of the details of the Greek myth. Early creator deities are often associated with this planet. Thus, Ptah, lord of Memphis and creator of the world, had the curious title Lord of the 30-year Circuit, a clear connection with the planet. Meanwhile, Zeus was associated with the planet Jupiter, which was his Roman name. Now Jupiter, head of the 12 Olympian gods, takes 12 years to orbit the Sun, essentially spending 1 year in each constellation around the zodiac. Jupiter also makes a retrograde motion as well and aligns with Saturn once every 20 years. This 20-year cycle between these planets were tracked. Every once in a very long while, Jupiter and Saturn will retrograde in conjunction, causing a triple alignment. This occurred around 6 BC and has been suggested as the phenomena behind the appearance of the new star announcing the birth of Jesus. At some point, Jupiter took the role of the measurer of time. overthrowing Saturn and becoming the mark by which the divine realm was maintained. Perhaps because it is easier to track Jupiter's movements, and because it is the fourth brightest object in the sky, and because it was seen as overruling Saturn in its 20-year conjunction cycle, which is also close to the Metonic lunar cycle, Jupiter became king of the gods. This was certainly the case in Babylon, where Marduk, who, like Zeus, is represented by the planet Jupiter. Marduk decides this planet will guide the stars. Curiously, the name for Jupiter in Babylonian is Nibiru, which can also mean pole or pivot. The north celestial pole was used in conjunction with the moving planets to divide up the year. In fact, one can use the stars of the Big Dipper as both a clock and a calendar. If one looks at this asterism in the pre-dawn of spring, one will see it tilted vertically to the north of the celestial pole. But at the same moment in summer, the Big Dipper lies parallel to the horizon, underneath the pole. In the fall, it has climbed up to the south of the pole, and in winter, it is overhead the pole. Not only can one use these stars to determine the seasons, but through close measuring, one can use them to determine the time. In any case, both Jupiter and Saturn remain embedded in the earliest cosmogonies for the role of dividing up the year by their annual motion. Of all the planets, Venus remains central in ancient mythologies. Like the moon, Venus was always portrayed as female. Aphrodite, Ishtar, Inanna, Astarte, and Shukra were all personifications of this planet. These mythologic figures were often seen as the Queen of Heaven, or as the royal bride or love symbol of the heavens. Again, the behavior of the planet informs the mythologies of the past. The first thing one notices about Venus is its pure luster. It is the third brightest object in the sky, and many hymns were written about this object in early cultures because of its brightness. Universally, this star was called the morning and evening star. Because Venus is closer to the sun than Earth, like Mercury, it is always seen in proximity to the sun, though with a peculiar celestial manifestation. When Venus travels west of the sun, it rises in the sky before dawn as the morning star. It appears in the pre-dawn light for about 263 days, rising up into the sky in the east and then turning and sinking to the horizon in the east. The planet then disappears as it travels behind the sun from the Earth's point of view for about 7 weeks. It then reappears on the western horizon after sunset as the evening star and stays there for about the same time, 263 days. This planet has a manifestation peculiar to the traveling wanderers. It rises and sets in the east as the morning star, and then it rises and sets in the west as the evening star. It is never seen in the west at dawn, and is never seen in the east at dusk. Further, the star is not up all night, but appears in the east and west as it sinks below the horizon or behind the light of the sun. For all these reasons, Venus was considered consort to the gods. While later mythologic associations analogized Venus with love because of her sheer beauty as a sparkling flame in the sky and as the consort of the rising and setting sun, earlier associations also linked this planet with the underworld because of its dominant role on the eastern and western horizon at the solar gates linked to the beyond, and because it disappeared into the underworld at regular intervals only to reappear on the opposite horizon. Not only were all the planets tracked across the sky, but so was every star. Some stars have a considerable mythology associated with them, and 3 of the oldest star names known just happen to be the 3 brightest stars in the sky, Sirius, Canopus, and Arcturus. While other bright stars were used as significant markers and were also embedded in myth, such as Vega and Capella. For example, in Hindu mythology, the world was said to rest on a turtle. In several images of the churning of the Milky Ocean, where the Asuras and Devas pull upon the cosmic serpent in an act of creation, the serpent is wrapped around the cosmic axis, which rests on a turtle. This image has an echo in Chinese myth, where Nuwa repairs the broken heavens by propping up the world on a turtle. It is a curious set of images, and in both Hindu and Chinese mythology, it is the legs of the turtle that hold up the heavens, but also the turtle itself is the foundation of the heavens. Of course, in celestial imagery, the turtle is the south celestial pole, upon which all of creation stands. However, most ancient civilizations lived north of the equator, and thus the true south celestial pole could never be seen. There was a star, however, that from the earliest days represented the south celestial pole. That star was the second brightest star in the sky, a golden yellow orb that was periodically seen low on the southern horizon, Canopus. It is indeed curious that one of the primeval Chinese gods, Shu Xing, whose name means star of long life, represented a particular star, Canopus. He is always depicted holding the golden peach of immortality, holding a long serpent staff, and is often associated with his animal symbols, the stork and the turtle. In ancient cosmography, Canopus sat below the foundations of the world at the end of the river constellation Eridanus. It is this river that both Jason and Heracles sailed down to obtain golden objects of immortality, a golden fleece and golden apples. Here, at the very end of the world, was the seed of creation from which all life sprang. The tortoise was a star. I have already referenced the myth of the birth of Hermes, who killed a turtle and used its shell to make a musical lyre, the first musical instrument. He sold this instrument to Apollo for 50 golden cows from the sun god's sacred herd. Here is another set of curious images. They all belong to cosmogonic tradition. Indeed, the lyre was also a star, Vega, in the constellation of the Lyre. It is the fifth brightest star in the sky. Curiously, in the age these myths were written, if an observer were to stand at the morning of spring equinox and watch the sunrise, they would see Vega rise high in the sky, reaching its apogee above the horizon at the breach of dawn. Vega is bright enough that it remains visible even after daybreak and is the last star seen in the northern sky. Meanwhile, that evening, one could turn south and see Canopus hover right above the horizon right as the sun set. Here we have a celestial frame, the north and south heavens, as the lyre and the turtle. Celestial cycles embedded in mythic figures can be quite complex, as demonstrated by the myth of Phaeton. According to the narrative, Phaeton was the offspring of the sun god Helios and the Oceanid Clymene. His mother told him he was the son of the solar god, and so Phaeton traveled to the domain of Helios to confront his father. Helios, glad to see his son, promised Phaeton any wish, and Phaeton demanded to drive the sun chariot. Against the better judgment of his father, Phaeton drove the sun chariot across the sky, but could not control the horses, and the sun careened too close to the earth, causing it to burn, and then it flung too far away, causing the earth to freeze and flood. The gods complained, and Zeus threw a thunderbolt at Phaeton, killing him instantly. His body fell from the chariot into the river Eridanus, where his 7 sisters, the Hyades, wept golden tears of amber and were turned into poplar trees. What does this myth mean? As it turns out, we have an ancient account. In Plato's Timaeus, Solon, the wisest of the Greeks, visits Egypt, where an old Egyptian priest recounts this myth and then gives this remarkable interpretation. There is a story, which even you have preserved, that once upon a time Phaeton, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burned up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving around the earth and in the heavens, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth recurring at long intervals of time. According to our ancient priest, this myth is not about a historical figure, a psychological archetype, or part of artistic literature, nor is it about corn gods, fetishes, or magical thinking. Astonishingly, the myth of Phaeton is about a declination of the bodies moving around the earth in the heavens, by which, through certain alignments and relationships, a great conflagration of things upon the earth occurs. Who would have guessed? This myth is a reminder to check one's measurements, also implying that there is a science of measurement, as well as a very, very long tradition of making those measurements. It turns out Phaeton is analogous to the first Greek charioteer, known as Erichthonius, and was imaged as a constellation in the sky, Auriga, the chariot driver. From the earliest times, this constellation was associated with a goat, and its brightest star, Capella, was known as the goat star. In myth, this goat is the being that suckled Zeus in his infancy until the solar god grew strong enough to crawl out of his cave and confront the Titans. To understand the association embedded in these myths, one must understand a celestial phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth is tilted 23 degrees on its own axis. The Earth rotates around its axis once every 24 hours, creating day and night. The Earth's axis, however, also rotates in sort of a wobbling circle, completing one axial rotation every 26,000 years. The change in the Earth's axis has interesting consequences for observers on Earth viewing the stars. The first consequence of Earth's axial wobble is the shifting of the vernal and solstice points on the ecliptic. As the Earth's axis moves, from the perspective of an earthbound observer, the entire frame of the heavens also move as different stars move into place on the horizon on the mornings of equinox and solstice. Of course, not only do the stars which are said to hold the sun on the morning of equinox and solstice change, but also the North Star or pole star changes over time. Today the North Star is Polaris, sparkling at the end of the handle of the Little Dipper. But 5,000 years ago, Thuban in the constellation Draco was the North Star. 5,000 years from now, Erai in the constellation Cephus will be the North Star. Again, from the point of view of an earthbound observer, if one were to stand and watch the rising stars in the east around 4500 BC and on the morning of spring equinox, one would see in the pre-dawn light stars rising above the horizon. A star cluster known as the Pleiades were the last stars seen before the rise of the sun from the underworld. These stars mark the constellation of the Bull, the modern Taurus. Thus, the constellation of the Bull was known to hold the sun and mark the rise of the new world in spring. Likewise, on the morning of the summer solstice, the constellation Leo held the rising sun. On the morning of the fall equinox, Scorpio held the rising sun. On the morning of the winter solstice, Aquarius held the rising sun. For generations, star watchers would watch for these stars rising with the sun to keep their calendars and demarcate the year through its solar cycle. Over time, however, something went wrong. Slowly, and due to the wobble of the Earth's axis, the stars that rose with the sun slipped out of place. They remained below the horizon while the stars above them took their place. The entire frame of heaven was out of its peg. Thus, by 2000 BC, Taurus no longer rose with the sun. Rather, Aries the ram was the constellation that announced the spring equinox. Meanwhile, Cancer announced the summer solstice, Libra announced the fall equinox, and Capricorn announced the winter solstice. The stars of heaven had fallen, and a new heaven and a new earth had been created. Because the stars of Aries are quite dim, they are easily consumed by the light of the sun, making it difficult to see those stars as equinox markers. However, just to the north of the constellation of the Ram is the solar chariot driver Auriga. The goat star, which nurses Zeus out of his cave, is the sixth brightest star in the sky and can be seen rising above the horizon well after the sun is breached. In fact, Capella is the last star standing in the morning light. Thus Capella, the goat of Zeus, was the emblem of the spring equinox and tied to the goat imagery of the age. Meanwhile, On the night of spring equinox, in the west, the stars that once marked the rising of spring now set with the sun in the evening. The seven sisters of Phaeton heliacally set at the edge of the river Eridanus, a constellation of stars placed right next to them. The myth appears to be what the Egyptian priests said it was, a mnemonic device describing cycles in the sky. The fact that Phaeton is struck by a lightning bolt suggests that Capella no longer announced the rising of Aries as the marker of spring. Capella remained below the horizon, struck down out of the heavens, and a new age had begun as the celestial fish replaced the ram on the horizon. There are many scholars who debate whether this phenomenon was known before the 2nd century BC. There are many myths and symbols across ancient cultures which strongly suggest that it was. The myth of Phaeton suggests awareness of the heavens falling out of place, but is but one story amongst many which share these myth themes. Theseus, for example, slays the offspring of King Minos, the Minotaur. Minos means bull, and this bull king has a bull son. Meanwhile, Theseus is son of King Aegeus, whose name means ram. The offspring of the ram slays the offspring of the bull as Athens rises as the new power in the Mediterranean. In Sumerian myth, Inanna travels to the underworld where her sister, Ereshkigal, rules. Her sister's husband is Gugulana, the bull of heaven. He has perished. Inanna travels to the underworld to witness the funeral rites. She rises from the underworld and weds Dumuzi, the heavenly shepherd. In the ancient Near East, bull gods reigned over the mythic pantheons, but by the early 2nd millennium BC, coincidentally at the time of the shift in the equinox markers on the horizon, there was a radical shift in imagery across cultures, and while the bull gods remained, the ram as symbol of deity grew in dominance. In Egypt, where there does not appear to be any ram constellation, ram imagery flooded the proverbial market. Thus, at Karnak, ram-headed sphinxes were built on the processional way of the temple, while several pharaohs' names also changed during this period. Their titles now include the name Amun, meaning ram. Abraham is told to sacrifice his son Isaac on the holy mountain. At the last moment, an angel saves Isaac and substitutes a ram caught in the thicket. The heavenly ram and the paschal lamb were more than symbols of sacrifice and meekness, but were solar symbols embedded in the changing cosmic landscape. Even so, during the change of the millennium, when Aries fell below the horizon and Pisces took its place on the morning of spring equinox, it was heard throughout Greece that the great Pan was dead. Meanwhile, the New Testament Jesus was not symbolized by a ram, but by a fish. This has been a brief survey of the cosmological underpinnings of many mythic motifs. It is crucial to understand that these myths and religious motifs are not specifically about celestial mechanics, such as the precession of the equinoxes. On the contrary, mythic narratives and symbols were embedded in the respective religious rites and teachings of their cultures and contained many uses and multiple meanings. It is clear, however, that behind a great many mythic figures and sacred symbols is a celestial context to which few refer or understand. One of the principal problems with uncovering technical data in ancient myths is the medium. Modern scholars demand written sources and examples to align with the myths so that something like precession of the equinoxes can be proved via a mythological narrative. Because there are no written sources describing the shift of the stars until Hipparchus the Greek, most scholars assume that knowledge of precession was not known before Hipparchus. But orality has its own demands and consequences. In oral cultures, technical know-how was a matter of a trade. Often technical knowledge was embedded in the cultus of a society, where songs and dances were part of the technical jargon. Admittedly, all this has been lost, and what scholars demand will never be produced. We are left wondering how far back was the knowledge of the stars known and orally recorded in myth and cult. We have only hints, and one must remember that from before the very first dynasty of Egypt, there existed already a solar, lunar, and stellar calendar. The cosmological tradition whispers to us from prehistory and will always be a source of debate and wonder.